So although many of our attitudes are relatively stable and enduring, they are at the same time open to change. So whether that's through new experiences, through interacting with individuals that we may previously had a negative attitude towards the group that they belong to, these experiences and interventions can lead us to update and to change existing attitudes that we had. And in this section, we're going to explore what's some of the evidence to suggest how much, to what degree can we change our attitudes, and what sorts of interventions tend to be effective for changing these attitudes that we might have. And again, this is what a lot of the kind of public policy intervention work, so from an applied perspective, a lot of this work is based on trying to change people's attitudes. So if you're trying to reduce people smoking, you're trying to then increase people's negative attitude towards cigarettes. Increase exercise, we improve the positive attitude towards being fit, etc. So one of the things that we're going to consider here is what happens if we measure attitudes at two different time points. So at a kind of baseline level, and then after some intervention has been implemented in order to change the attitude, how much can we change them, and what interventions are effective? And we're going to look at this particularly from a perspective of understanding how different forms of intergroup contact can influence our attitudes. So especially how it's going to influence your attitude towards outgroup members that you may have originally had a negative attitude towards. So what we're going to consider here is the results that come out of three different meta-analyses. So a meta-analysis is essentially where you combine and aggregate the outcomes, the effect sizes from multiple individual studies to get a kind of overall picture of what is the effect from some particular intervention. And what we're looking at here is what is the effect in laboratory studies of asking people to engage in imaginary intergroup contact. So what we're interested in here is what happens when I imagine engaging with and interacting with somebody from an outgroup. How does that change my opinions of people from that outgroup? And generally in many of these studies, what you would be interested in doing is taking an individual and getting them to think about an outgroup that they probably have a negative stereotype or a negative attitude, a pre-existing negative attitude towards, with the idea of improving and boosting this attitude. And a lot of this is based off of Gordon Allport's contact hypothesis. So this is the idea that spending time, so intergroup contact, is one of the most potent and effective ways of improving attitudes towards this outgroup or other group member. So say if I wanted to study how do Israelis and Palestinians, how would they adjust or change the attitudes that they might have towards each other. One of the challenges in doing this in a laboratory setting is that it's very difficult maybe to get people from the two different groups to come together in the first place. So one of the easiest ways and simplest interventions you could do is, rather than getting people to physically engage in contact, is just to engage in a kind of imaginary intergroup contact. And it's what Gordon Allport originally called like the sort of fantasy level or kind of first step of contact, the contact hypothesis. So in the meta-analysis that looked at what happens when you get people just to imagine having contact with somebody else, this tended to shift people's evaluations. So they improved their evaluations of other people. This worked at an explicit level. So 14% of people were more likely to have a more positive attitude to the outgroup than those who were in a control condition that didn't imagine contact. and also had a beneficial effect for implicit attitudes. So again, if you measure this using the IAT, 12% were more likely to have a more positive attitude to the outgroup than those who didn't imagine contact. Now again, these are not huge effects that are occurring here, but if you've got a lot of animosity between two different groups, then even these sort of small effects may be beneficial as a kind of applied intervention that's there. There was also, when you look at the factors that might moderate this effect, so in other words, what elements about the original study might be really beneficial or might work best, the more elaboration, so the more detail that you go into, and the more you imagine sort of being in a vivid scenario where you're having contact with this other group, the better those interventions seem to be. So relatively modest or small effects here. There's also meta-analysis that considers what happens when we do more interactive intergroup contact. So Lemmer and Wagner do a meta-analysis of data from 123 comparisons with over 11,000 participants, where they had direct, so this is either face-to-face or indirect contact. So indirect contact would be, say if you're speaking over Skype or Zoom, or you're on the telephone or writing to each other. So they've got some degree of contact in a real-world setting. And then they were interested, how does that influence your attitudes? And consistently, there was an effect where participants that were in an intervention, as opposed to being in a control group that would have done similar tasks but wouldn't have had this intergroup contact, participants in the intervention group had significantly more positive intergroup attitudes compared to the control group participants. And some of the things that come out of this that are important is that this intergroup contact seems to be beneficial even in situations where there is a high degree of animosity. So if you look at societal conflict in the Middle East, these are regions where there's a lot of hatred between groups that are there. But doing these interventions still was effective despite this degree of animosity. There's some evidence that attitude change is generally largest for the ethnic majorities, but you still get this impact, albeit smaller, for the minority group. One of the reasons for this is the idea that the minority group, so the one that are probably typically experiencing the most degree of prejudice and discrimination, is that when you're engaging this intergroup contact, they're the ones that have much more concern about being confronted with prejudice and discrimination, whereas the typical majority group members don't necessarily arrive at this intergroup contact situation with any fear of being kind of prejudiced or anxious. So the minority also have much more attention to the fact that their group has a devalued status. And there's also another argument that the minority members' initial attitudes towards the majority members is often probably less negative than the other way around. Maybe because they've had kind of more frequent previous contact experiences in the past. So yeah, there's certainly some evidence to suggest that the majority find it easier to update and change their values as opposed to the minority group. And the contact interventions not only improve attitudes towards those individuals that were in that intergroup contact intervention, it generalizes, which is really important. You wouldn't find it an especially effective intervention if it only worked on the people that you've ended up meeting with, if you only improved your attitude towards them. The thing that's important is that it generalizes in your attitude that you have towards this entire group. So yeah, that's an important factor that's in there. It's also possible to examine how naturally occurring events can have an impact and shift attitudes. So one nice example of this was in 2008, the election of Barack Obama as the first black US president. And what researchers were interested in here was just studying, would it be the case that having a high status black American, that this would have an impact on people's implicit prejudice or implicit attitudes towards African American or black people more generally within the US. And you do find an effect. There was a benefit of Barack Obama's election, so you find that people's implicit attitudes towards blacks improved by 21%. So 21% more positive after compared to before his election. So one of the ways that they test this is using something known as the effective lexical priming task. And if you think back to some of the earlier stuff that we've talked about, you should be familiar with the lexical decision task. So this was where you're presented with a prime. So typically it was a word, and then it's followed by a letter string. And your job is just to say whether that letter string that you're presented with is a real word or a non-word. Now, in the effective lexical priming, rather than receiving a prime as a word, in this case they present faces. So you'd be presented with a black or a Caucasian face. Then you're presented with a letter string. So in this case the words love or milk. And your job is just to say, is the word love or milk a real or a non-word? So in the first one, yes, love is. In the second one, milk, no, that's incorrect. And the idea, the same with the lexical decision task, is that initial prime should activate associated concepts. So if you have a negative evaluation of black Americans and you're presented with the face of a black person, that should prime negative associations, negative evaluations, and then you would be quicker to respond if the target string is presenting a negatively valenced word. So if it presents something negative like death or cancer or harm, etc., you would be faster to respond to it, as opposed to if you're presented with a target letter string that explains a positive word such as love. So again, you can look at the kind of contrast in reaction times here to try and get an indication of what are people's automatic associations when they're seeing the black and the Caucasian faces presented there. So again, 21% more positive implicit attitudes is quite a significant shift that occurs from this. There's also evidence that our own personal values that we hold can be really important for determining whether interventions are effective in changing our attitudes towards a particular topic or not. So in this case, we're going to look at how people's attitudes change with regard to conservation and pro-environmental messaging. So this is a study by Wolsko and colleagues, and what they're interested in here is the idea that generally liberals, as opposed to conservatives, tend to report much greater engagement in environmentally friendly behaviours. So they tend to be much stronger supporters of the idea that we need good environmental regulation. They're concerned with environmental problems. They care about climate change, etc. And Wolsko's research was kind of based on the premise that maybe one of the reasons that liberals tend to engage in much more of this is that the arguments that are presented in favour of conservation is framed and explained in a kind of ideological and moral framework, or certainly in moral terms, that just simply hold much greater appeal for liberals as opposed to conservatives. So in other words, the kind of moral tone and the moral argument is framed in a way that fits liberals and conflicts with conservative values. And it's for this reason that a lot of conservatives kind of reject the the arguments for conservation and why we should be concerned about climate change. So one of the ways that you see that is that a lot of the framing of environmental issues is around focusing on the kind of injustices and in terms of the level of harm or care that's associated with environmental behaviours. So in other words, doing this is going to make sure that you care for the planet, that you avoid any harm. And this is a message that we know appeals to liberal values. But we don't think it appeals very well to conservative moral concerns that are much more oriented around the need for in-group loyalty and having respect for authority. So in a series of studies, Wasko and colleagues basically wanted to see what happens if you vary the way that these moral issues are framed. What happens if you appeal to liberal versus conservative concerns? How would this influence the way that people update or change their attitudes? Okay, so in the study they presented participants with an environmental message and varied how it could be presented in 3 different ways. And participants were then randomly assigned to read through this information in one of these 3 different conditions. So the first one was this individualizing morality. So in this case, the environmental argument is framed in terms of emphasizing the harm, emphasizing that you need to care for the environment, emphasizes fairness and justice. So show your love for all of humanity in the world in which we live by helping to care for our vulnerable natural environment, help to reduce the harm done to the environment by taking action, etc. So show compassion, basically. And this is the idea that liberals should be receptive to this message, but maybe not so for conservatives. So there was a second condition which they called binding morality, and in this condition the message really emphasizes loyalty. It emphasizes focusing on authority, purity, and patriotism. So show your love for the country by joining the fight to protect the purity of America's natural environment. Take pride in the American tradition of performing one's civic duty by taking responsibility for yourself and the land you call home, etc. Show your patriotism. And finally, there was also a control condition, which explained the same message, but didn't include any of the sort of moralizing tones in these 2 arguments. But for the sake of now, we're going to sort of ignore the results from the control condition. So what were the outcomes that occur from this? So what we've got plotted on the left-hand side is the outcomes for one study, where they focus on conservation intentions. And on the right-hand side, it's for a different message that focused on climate change. So the higher score along the y-axis for both of these is indicating that you've got more pro-environmental attitudes. And then plotted on the left-hand side is the score for liberals, on the right-hand side is for conservatives. So the interesting effect that comes out of this is that for liberals, it doesn't really matter how that message is framed. So it turns out that they are likely to have a positive pro-environmental attitude, irrespective of the framing. Whereas in contrast, for conservatives, when you frame the argument in terms of care and harm, they really don't care. That pro-environmentalism and rating is kind of right down at the bottom. It's low. The same with the control condition. Whereas it's only when you frame it in terms of this binding argument, so you frame it in terms of sort of justice, authority, patriotism, etc., that they do now seem to care and change their attitudes. So they care when this pro-environmental attitude demonstrates loyalty to the in-group respect for authority, maintenance of purity and sanctity in human endeavours. So I think that's a nice example of sometimes just a simple change to the way that you design an intervention that can appeal to people's values is going to be really important in being able to change their attitudes in important domains. There's also evidence that when we're trying to shift our attitude or decide our attitude on a particular issue, it can be influenced by two things. So one is our current sort of self-interest. How relevant, what kind of impact is this going to have on me? Is it going to have a negative or positive effect? And then what are your long-standing moral values? And it turns out these two things can have different effects depending on the temporal distance of the sort of intervention or the action and the behavior that's going to occur. So that maybe doesn't make much sense. So let's have a look at a nice research study that shows this. So Hunt et al., they presented participants with this fictitious scenario where you've been told that the university has asked the researchers to gauge students' reactions to a policy change that's going to lead to a 10% increase in tuition fees. But the purpose of this 10% increase is to try and help recruit more minority students. So we've got something that is sort of disadvantage to you. It's going to involve you needing to pay a little bit more money for your tuition fees. But it's got a kind of positive impact. That the general positive effect of this is that it's going to increase those that wouldn't normally be able to come will be able to benefit and attend the university. The key manipulation then was they would either tell participants that this policy is going to come into effect after 1 week. So it's an imminent change. It's about to happen. Or there was a delayed condition where this policy would come into effect after a year. Now they then measured two variables. One is the financial burden that was faced by students. And the reason for doing this is to get a gauge of how much is that 10% increase going to actually impact you. Is it the case for those students that are really rich, maybe 10% doesn't mean much. Whereas for other students that are much poorer, that can just about afford, then yeah, that financial burden would make much more of a difference. They then measured their moral values using this social dominance orientation scale. So this is a scale that measures people's values towards equality versus inequality. So you can look at, these are 16 items that appear on the social dominance orientation scale. So some examples are: number one, some groups of people are simply inferior to other groups, and getting what you want is sometimes necessary to use force against other groups. So it's how much do you favour this sort of inequality that exists and should be upheld, or certainly not necessarily resisted. And they used these variables to predict or understand how much those self-interest and your moral values contributed towards your decisions when you were in the imminent and the delayed decision task. And essentially, if you think that this financial increase is going to occur in a week's time, the main predictor, the main thing that mattered then was people's current financial burden. So if you didn't have much money to spare, that was the most important thing in deciding whether we should approve this or not. Whereas in the delayed decision, people then seem to focus less on the financial capability. And what is the strongest predictor is the social dominance orientation. So it's their political moral values that then drive whether they think this is the correct or the incorrect decision. So in other words, if you're someone that doesn't have much money, and making this 10% increase would be really tough on you at a personal level, you would oppose the policy if it's going to kick in straight away. But if it's going to kick in a year's time, that gives you an opportunity to think, yeah, maybe the money isn't important. And then if your political values, if you value equality quite highly, so you score very low on the social dominance orientation, you might think, yeah, this is a good policy, even if it's going to hit me. So that's a nice example of how these effects can depend on the temporal or the psychological distance to the behaviour or the decision that's going to occur. There's also evidence that our attitudes towards leaders can be influenced by the specific emotions. So particularly anger and anxiety can influence the way that we feel about presidents or prime ministers of a country. So this is often referred to as a rally around the flag effect, where you've got some sort of external threat. So for example, if it's caused through terrorism or going to war with another country, that can increase the level of support that is experienced. And this effect seems to be especially strong for right-leaning leaders. So a couple of famous examples of this in Argentina was General Galtieri, who had really unpopular ratings until he went to war with the UK over the Falklands Islands. And then suddenly his approval ratings shot up. George W. Bush had terrible approval ratings just prior to the 9/11 terrorist attacks in New York, and then they increased to sort of 90% after he decided to kind of confront the sort of the causes of the terrorism there and went to war with Afghanistan. And this approval is argued to be mediated by the amount of increase in anger and anxiety, which essentially the argument is that it then wants us to have a leader who's willing to take on and challenge the enemy that's there. So if we look at, these are approval ratings of George W. Bush over the time that he was in charge, you get these huge spikes that occur during or just after the September 11th attacks, the invasion of Iraq, and then the capture of Saddam Hussein. Okay, staying on the theme of emotions, there's also some research that examines how the emotion regulation strategies that we might use can be really important for determining the attitudes that you end up forming. So one study that I really like and I think is an important applied one was done by Halperin et al. And essentially, so this was looking at the conflict and issues in Israel and Palestine. And they had Israeli participants that would watch this anger-inducing video about Palestinian aggression. So they would show this to participants, but they would then have informed them before this that when you watch the footage that's occurring, we want you to react in one of two ways. There was a reappraisal condition, so half of the participants would watch the video and they were told that what we want you to do is just react in the most sort of scientific, analytic way that you possibly can. So don't focus on the sort of emotional components of it. Just think about it as dispassionately and as kind of analytically as you can. And then there was another control condition that just viewed the video as normal, so no specific instructions. After watching it, participants were then asked to rate what is your level of anger and rage, and then importantly, what is your support for conciliatory versus aggressive policies. And they gave them specific policies. So for example, do you agree that Israel should transfer food? Or an aggressive policy, so if the Israeli Defense Force detect a terrorist among civilians, they should bomb the building, even if it's the case that most civilians would die. And what you get out of this is, in the context of the emotions that you experience, the reappraisal led to reduced levels of anger. So this is basically like a flow diagram illustrating those mediation effects. And each of those paths indicates the effect of one on the next variable. So reappraisal had a negative relationship with anger, so you're less angry. But then reappraisal also had a positive effect on the support for conciliatory policies. So engaging in the reappraisal made you more likely to approve that you should resolve the issues and support conciliation. And similarly for aggressive policies. So reappraisal there made you less likely to endorse engaging in kind of aggressive retaliation. So again, there's a relatively small sample size that were in this. But they found in a second study these measures of anger and the attitudes persisted even several months, so up to 5 months after the manipulation of the cognitive reappraisals. You still had these effects occurring over the long term. So these are sort of important applied interventions that are worth kind of considering and have really important real world impact.